Good afternoon to everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, that's fine. What we'll do today is finish that part of the program of the module devoted to legal systems and sort of the international relations and international law system, to see how legal systems are placed in a context of international relations. Last week we saw a little bit of the United Nations systems, some of its agencies, and we saw in particular the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and seen how the International Monetary Fund somehow is there to try to establish, to guarantee financial stability and to give a reasonable and effective substitute to the gold standard. If you remember, the gold standard was a system by which the currency, the value of a currency depended on how much gold reserves the central bank held. And this worked to a certain point, and then obviously there was not enough gold, and this brought to enormous devaluation of currencies. So after the Second World War, this system, this dual system, on one hand the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and on the other hand the World Bank, created both in 1944 in Bretton Woods. Now what we'll see today, there was a question last week on what is the relation between the IMF and the World Bank. We'll see it in a moment, and I'll go to the slides here. Here we are. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, just to be sure, I just want to lift the volume a little bit more. Obviously I've been using Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck and his three nephews as sort of a metaphor, and there you see obviously Uncle Scrooge with a whole lot of money there in his hat, and three nephews who are there rather perplexed because obviously to have that money there's a whole lot of conditionality. We saw that how the IMF gives money to balance trade deficits, but obviously asks for a certain amount of conditions. Now the World Bank, which is this other twin of these two international organizations that were created in the same context, initially the World Bank, its function was mostly that of financing post-war reconstruction and development. So that was the main problem that was occupied for at least 10, 15 years of the World Bank. What happened starting from the 60s, 1960s, what happens in the more or less in geopolitics, that all the two major colonial powers, that is France and Great Britain, started leaving their colonies, both in mostly in Africa, but also partly also in Asia, and therefore this brought to the creation of a whole lot of new states. Now all these new states were substantially not very developed, rather undeveloped, in a stage of development or underdevelopment, and therefore the World Bank started entering in this field of providing resources to these other, to these new countries that had just become independent. So, just to show that the first 10, 15 years was reconstruction of developed countries, mostly in Europe, and then afterwards developing new states, new nations that came out of decolonization in Africa and Asia, and then obviously Latin America. So what happens is a considerable amount of money which is given to projects, development projects. So what happens? Well, while the International Monetary Fund, its purpose is that of rebalancing trade deficits with a short term, 1 year, a year and a half. Here in the World Bank, we have long-term projects, which are long-term means 30 to 40 years. That shows you what we mean by long-term, and mostly in long-term human and social development that private creditors do not finance. So the first thing is tell the countries, well, if you can find external sums to finance these projects, obviously you can get money from from financial institutions, but if you don't find money there, obviously you will just think of a country which is a poor country which has natural resources. So obviously you probably would find some international financial institution that will give you money to develop and exploit those natural resources. While in other projects, just think of irrigation, land reclaiming, infrastructures and so on, you probably don't find any money, and therefore you go to the World Bank and you ask money to the World Bank. The World Bank is a bank. It has money that is given by its members, which are mostly nearly all the nations of the world, and it has a bank. It operates like a bank, and it puts and it lends money to the states on these long-term financial aid for a low interest. Now, obviously, the main resources of the World Bank are the money that is deposited with the World Bank by the countries, by the various members. But you can easily understand that the request for financial loans is much higher than the availability of resources. So the World Bank finds itself has not enough money. How does it solve this issue with a lot of requests of valuable requests of meritorious requests by developing countries to have money, and but the World Bank does not have sufficient amount of money. It does it in a rather typical way, which let's see if I can go to the next slide. No, sorry. What does the World Bank do? The World Bank borrows money on the international capital markets. Just think that a whole lot of institutions that have lots of money, but that they are looking for sort of low risk investments. So you might find very important financial institutions that have a lot of money, but they don't know where to put it because they think it might be risky. So they lend this money to the World Bank, and the World Bank is a guarantee. You know the World Bank will repay you. So as the the World Bank has an AAA rating because you know it will repay you. So the banks are very willing to, these banks are very willing to lend the money to the World Bank, and then the World Bank uses it for its long-term investment projects. So just to show you that how the system works, in this case it works as an intermediary. It collects money from the world capital markets, and then it lends this money, it borrows it from the international capital market, and it lends it to developing countries for long-term development projects. And so this means that system has much more money in it than because these financial institutions would not lend it directly. Would a bank lend directly money to Haiti or to, let's imagine, for the Central African Republic for some kind of development project? No, because they don't trust, they think that they won't be repaid. So they lend the money to the World Bank and they know they will be repaid, and the World Bank instead lends the money to these countries. So just to show how the system works. But as for the IMF, the World Bank sets a certain amount of conditions. They are less stringent conditions than the ones we've seen in the IMF. They're less stringent, but what does the World Bank ask? First of all, economic management. The World Bank says, I'm giving you lots of money, I want to know how this money is managed. Obviously, money management is not something simple. It requires a certain amount of expertise. You must have accounts, proper accounts. These money must go in a certain direction. You must try to avoid that this money goes into is wasted. Let's put it in a very mild fashion. Just the money given by the World Bank is wasted. Generally what happens, unfortunately, is very often it's used, it goes into corrupt practices. But let's imagine that the countries are not there, developing countries, underdeveloped countries, and they do not have the economic management expertise. So that's the first requirement that the World Bank asks. Country must provide itself with some kind of economic management. Secondly, structural policies. So just if you just imagine that if you have receiving a lot of money for irrigation. Now for us, irrigation in Italy or in Europe seems a rather common problem. There's no really scarcity of water, but in most developing countries, the problem of making water or electricity arrive in the countryside, in the small towns and parts of the country which are isolated, well, it is complex. So you must have a whole plan of how are you going to organize the waterworks, the electricity network, and so on, just to show that this requires a structural policy of the country, not just to say, I want to bring water there. Now, how are you going to get it? Where are you going to get this water? What is going to be your waterwork policy, and so on? Then policies for social inclusion and equality, and here you see very clearly that there is a very strong social pressure by the World Bank. For example, having first of all, equality, women's equality, social inclusion. That means creating also schools. I'll give you money, but you must, for rural areas, but it's not sufficient that you bring water and electricity. You must build schools. If you don't have schools, that means social inclusion. I won't give you the money. So this shows you how the World Bank somehow works. And then public sector management and institutions. Who's going to regulate all this? for us, sort of the Western hemisphere, those who are brought up in the Western and developed world, for us, public institutions seems quite obvious. In other countries, it's not at all obvious how they work, and so you must strengthen public institutions, how they work, how they're going to just, let's make typically the example of schooling, education, or health. You need obviously to organize the educational system and public health system. So, and this is very complex. So you're not only given money, for example, to build a new hospital, but you say, who's going to work in this hospital? How are you going to, your doctors and your paramedics going to be trained? So just to show you how complex, when we talk about development in countries, well, this is a very, requires a whole lot of other interventions. So just to point out that this is how these two twin institutions intervene, and they intervene on the basis of economic forecast, economic surveys. It is their decisions are entirely based on economics, but then they turn into some kind of legal provisions. If you think of all the kind of interventions that the IMF puts on government and on parliament, it says, I'll give you the money if you change your pension, your retirement schemes, if you change your taxation system, your labor market, and so on. And the World Bank intervenes more indirectly, but also there it somehow changes and asks for substantial reforms in those areas, whether it is agricultural reform, educational reform, infrastructure reform. So also here we have a whole lot of legislation and implementation of this legislation, which is imposed by an international organization such as the World Bank. The World Bank and the IMF are two international organizations which are under the umbrella of the United Nations. We'll just look shortly, very briefly, at other two institutions which are not under the umbrella of the UN, but somehow play a similar role to that of the IMF. The issue of financial stability is, as I've mentioned, particularly important because it is felt that where there is financial instability, this brings to economic crisis, or economic crisis provokes financial instability, and this has very negative consequences, not only in the country, but in the whole economic and geopolitical system as a whole. And so I'll just talk very shortly, very briefly, of the Bank for International Settlements and the Financial Stability Board, because these two institutions that work very much together are somehow there to guarantee the sort of world financial stability. Just keep in mind, we're talking of these institutions because we're trying to understand who runs the world. I mean, we know, we've seen how a country is run. We know the executive, the legislative, the judiciary. So we know how the powers are within a country and how these powers are somehow balanced and how they relate one with another. But when we look at the broader picture, we look at the world, we ask ourselves, who's in charge there? What are the rules? Is there a world constitution? No, there's no world constitution. Is there an effective separation of powers? No, from the sense of legislative, executive, and judiciary. No, they're very small pieces. So we are trying to understand to what extent the system is, the world order is guaranteed. We've seen international treaties, international organizations, and here we see these economic organizations World Bank, IMF, and now we see some others, just to understand how the world is governed. We can't understand whether we live in Switzerland or in Canada, in Brazil or in Indonesia. We can't understand how the world is governed if we don't look also at these international institutions. So this is the sense of this part of the module. Now, just to go Bank for International Settlements, I make it very short. I won't, so the history is a very complex history which dates back to the 1930s, but it is based in Switzerland. It is a bank. It is a private institution, but it is financed by member states. Members, who are the members of the Bank of International Settlement? 60 central banks, which represent 95% of the world GDP. So this gives you already an idea of how the wealth is distributed. So we see that these countries are 95%. That means the other 130 countries, more or less, are only 5%. This shows us how how complex the economic governance of the world. We have enormous amount of countries which are very, very poor, or they're very, very small. Maybe they're not poor. People live maybe in Tonga, the Fiji Islands, Samoa. They live perfectly well. They're very happy. People love living there, and they don't need much. The climate is good, and they have everything they want. But they don't have much in GDP. They don't produce much. So just to show you that if we're looking at economic factors and who produces wealth that then is traded, and we look at that in a moment, well, we see that in 60 countries, which are more or less around the world, it's not only the Western Hemisphere, well, these 60 countries are, well, 95% of the world GDP. So, what does the Bank of International Settlement do? Well, first of all, it plays the role of, seems a sort of a monopoly game, but anyhow, it plays the role of the bank of the central banks. One says, does the central bank need money? Yes, the central banks, it could be the Italian central bank, it could be the Turkish central bank, it might be the Peruvian central bank that needs, has problems of liquidity. If there is somehow some kind of crisis, well, they need to go, where do they go and ask money immediately? They just need the money immediately. Not a problem of, we're talking of central banks, not of countries. So if central banks find themselves in the issue of a problem of liquidity, where do they go? They go to the Bank of International Settlements. Why is the Bank of International Settlements so important? Because the Bank of International Settlement, throughout these, these 90 years of its existence, it holds about 10 to 15% of the gold reserves of the world's central banks. Now, why is this? Just think of a developing country which has a very politically very unstable. We know that lots of these countries, developing countries, are politically unstable. Now, if someone wants to take over power, and in these countries, generally you don't take over powers by voting, you just, you get generally some military coup d'etat, some general who sends his armored tanks. And so when you take hold of the government, you overthrow the existing government and you take hold of the government, the first thing you do, first thing is you occupy the broadcasting television headquarters, and then you go to the central bank and get all the gold that is there. Now, as this has happened very often, what do the central banks of these countries, of these developing countries do? Well, they say, listen, it's not safe keeping gold here, because anybody who gets hold of, becomes does a revolution, anyhow a coup d'etat, overthrows the government, will simply steal this money. So we're going to send it to Switzerland. We're going to send it to the Bank of International Settlements, where it is quite sure it is physically there. We as country, we know it's there, it's deposited there, and nobody can steal it from us. So just to point out that especially from developing countries who feel it is not safe to keep their gold in their own central bank vaults, well, they send it to Switzerland. So you go in the headquarters of the BIS, and there's a vault, and just like when you go and you find it's sort of the gold that belongs to Ghana, or the gold that belongs to Laos or some other country. It feels it's safer. The gold it holds is better there being in Switzerland than being at home. And so the Bank of International Settlement is very strong because it has considerable amount of gold reserves. But there's a further element for which the BIS is so important. As mentioned, the BIS is based in Switzerland, in Basel. And in Basel, there's this Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which is particularly important because it regularly comes out with standards for supervision by central banks over domestic banks. It tells central banks, whether it could be the Central Bank of Nigeria, Central Bank of Uruguay, Central Bank of Italy, whatever country it is, he tells this is how you should supervise your domestic banks to be sure that these domestic banks work properly. And we've seen throughout the years how these guidelines that are set out by the Basel Committee, remember, BIS means the 60 main central banks. So they agree on this, on these principles, on these standards that should be followed by central banks in controlling domestic banks. And you can easily realize that these are not, these guidelines are become then laws. So there are guidelines to the central banks, so the BIS gives this indications to the central banks, and then the central banks have these things put into law. So if you are a domestic bank and you want to operate in a certain country, whatever that country is, whether it is Colombia or it is Sweden, whether it is Indonesia or Canada, well, you must follow certain rules which are set out by this Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. And typically, you will hear when you somehow, maybe further on in your classes, you find this constant reference to Basel III, which is the list of requirements that domestic banks must have to obtain authorization to operate as financial institutions. So what happens is that this, now we already arrived to Basel IV, but it isn't, obviously this dramatic economic and financial crisis will slow down the implementation of Basel IV, but the whole idea is having a certain amount of criteria, which are legally binding criteria, that somehow are imposed to domestic banks in order to operate as financial institutions. Now, this could seem somehow not very important unless you're particularly interested in banking law and in financial law, but it has a very important downstream and ripple effect. Why? Because if a bank is told that it must follow certain standards to operate, what will the bank do? The bank will then transfer the same criteria when it operates to all those who borrow money from the bank. And so whenever a company goes to the bank and asks for money, well, the bank will apply those criteria that are set by the Basel III by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, they will apply to companies or individuals asking for a loan. One of the reasons, just to show you how this is important, we are all in developed countries very concerned with the economic crisis owing to the coronavirus pandemic. All governments are putting money on the sort of saying, well, we'll put resources and we are going to allow companies, enterprises to have money. And we're going to cover these loans to companies up to a certain extent. But where does this money pass through? It passes through banks. Because if you're a small company, you need, let's say, 50,000 or 100,000 euros to restart after this crisis, well, you have to go to a bank. Now, when will this bank give you the money? The bank will say, hey, 1 second, is this money, can I lend this money? According to Basel III, no, I cannot. So you must find some kind of guarantee, a state guarantee, and the banks, quite rightly, and this is why they're very attentive in not handing out the money like that. They're very attentive because they know that if they give the money to a company and then they don't have the government backing, someone will start getting very cross with them, and probably they will be very severe sanctions. So this is one of the reasons why in all the developed world, banks are very sort of cautious even in this, where there's an announcement that the government will cover. The banks say, hey, yes, announcement is fine. Well, we like these tweets, we like these decrees, but we want to see, as the Americans say, where's the beef? We want to see the beef. I mean, until the money, we know that exactly the money is there, we're not going to lend money to anybody because we don't have sufficient guarantees from the borrower to give money to this enterprise. So just to show you how complex the system is and how this is all a fact of legal regulation of credit. So as we are lawyers and we are interested very much in credit and debit, well, we must try to understand why banks are somehow very cautious in lending money if they don't have guarantees. There's a state guarantee, let me see this guarantee. It isn't sufficient that whoever, whether it is President Trump or British Prime Minister or the French President of the Republic or the German Chancellor or the Italian Prime Minister says, oh, we're going to put money at disposal. No. You want to, if you are in a bank, you're cautious, you want to see the money, you want to know that the money actually, that guarantee is actually there, and then obviously you will lend the money to those who ask the money. Just to show you that this has to do very much with private law and the private law of debit and credit, and you don't give money if you don't have a guarantee. No guarantee, no money. This is a very basic rule in any private law transaction. Just to show you, I mean, we started looking at the sort of Bank of International Settlements, a very sort of distant institution apparently, and then we go back, we come to reality and to debit credit relations between an enterprise and a bank, and who puts them, if the bank, at what conditions can the bank give money to an enterprise that is asking for money. So just to show you that it is not something theoretical. This is how an international, it's a private company created by central banks, but it is incorporated under the Swiss code. So it is a company under Swiss law, just like many other companies, only it is controlled. Who are the shareholders? Well, not individuals, they are central banks. Central banks are the shareholders of the Bank of International Settlement. And so this international organization influences when we go to ask money to a bank for its consumers, or a company goes and asks money to the bank, well, Basel III somehow has an influence on these private law transactions. Now, we've seen one. This is a sort of an international institution, so there's no doubt about that. We know that the Bank of International Settlement is an international institution. We are going to look at another institution, which is equally important, which is the Financial Stability Board. Now, the Financial Stability Board, while the BIS is an international institution which is incorporated in Swiss law, the Financial Stability Board is an informal institution, but very important. What is the created in 1999? They were only the famous G7. Now it is the ministers of finance and the governors of central banks of the G20. So you look at them: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, European Union, France, Germany, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Netherlands, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, UK, USA. So this gives you, I mean, big countries, as you can see, big and important countries, and that are have lots of financial interest in their own country and around the world. Now, what does the Financial Stability Board do? The Financial Stability Board, first of all, as I've mentioned, it's an informal international institution, which is very, very important, but it doesn't work while the BIS finds an agreement between the central banks, and then this becomes some kind of legally binding rule in the countries of the 60 member states, because this is how supervision must be made on the domestic banks. Here, instead, what do we have? Moral suasion and peer pressure. So it's an international forum where people discuss and intervene, and indirectly. So there are actions to be taken, and especially governors of central banks find, as they have all grown up in a certain way, they've all somehow done the same training, they've always been together, working together, they sort of understand, or they should understand, what are the most appropriate decisions to be taken. Now, what is the role of the Financial Stability Board? Financial Stability Board has somehow works as a censor of what are crises that are growing up. Now, for example, everybody at the Financial Stability Board is very concerned trying to understand what could be the effects of the pandemic, the financial effects of the pandemic on, obviously, on financial stability. We're talking of financial stability. And so they're looking at systemic risks. What is a systemic risk? A risk that develops concerns the whole system. It doesn't concern one sector. For example, let's say the hotel industry. Okay, the hotel industry is very much in difficulty. But when it starts becoming the hotel industry, the catering and restoration sector, it comes with always travel and transport sector. When you see these things together, you say, does this bring to a systemic risk in the financial risk? When you find these huge airlines, just think of British Airways, Lufthansa, Air France, just to mention three very big air companies, and they're no longer able to pay monies to providers and so on. What are repay the banks from which they've been borrowing money? What happens? Are they systemic risks? So they're trying to understand what are the systemic risks in the financial sector. Why? Because, and the term is constantly used in financial sector, but it's very appropriate. in this context what they call contagion. The fact that if there is one country that is in great difficulty, just think, I've mentioned many times the Greek crisis 6 years ago. I mean, what happens if Greece declares default? Suddenly the Greek government says, I can't repay my debts. What is there going to be a so-called domino effect on other countries? Now, this is something that happens quite often, that there is one country which is contagious, and this contagion, the virus of financial instability or of financial default, is transferred, goes from one country to another, and the domino effect, if you know how the domino effect is, you put all the domino pieces one after the other, and you push one down, and all the others fall down. So this is the whole main concern of the Financial Stability Board, to know immediately, to intervene overnight, saying, hey, listen, this country is in a dramatic financial crisis. It is not able to repay its debts. We must immediately intervene. Now, this is somehow just to think of countries which are highly dependent on natural resources. Think of the countries which are dependent, their main resource is oil. Now, the barrel was oil was about $50, $60 per barrel. Now it's less than $20 per barrel. Now, what effect does it have? Does this mean that Saudi Arabia, just to mention a very rich country, is in financial difficulty? Could this crisis have an effect on all those very important financial countries which are in the Persian Gulf, Emirates, Qatar, or Oman? What are the effects on the region? So just to show that this idea of financial contagion is very significant. What does this mean? That when the Financial Stability Board sees something that is dramatically a crisis, immediately intervenes and tells certain governments to take certain measures, typical measure. And this shows you how you start from G20, which seems somehow in the clouds, and we go down to a very practical case. It tells the country, now banks must close. You can't withdraw your deposits, because when there's a financial crisis, well, obviously there's panic and everybody wants to withdraw the money from the banks, because everybody's afraid that their money won't be worth anything because of the very strong devaluation. So what are you doing? You are imposing restrictions in withdrawal of money, and in withdrawal of deposits. In the Greek crisis 6 years ago, people who had a bank account were allowed to collect, they could withdraw with their ATM, not more, I think, more than 500, 600 euros per week, just to give you the idea. So you had the money there, but it was frozen. You could only get 500, 600 euros from your ATM. That was it. So that meant that there was no possibility of withdrawing the money. So that means freezing the whole economic system, and obviously means that you cannot, those who had to repay debts or had to buy something, well, they had to have a very limited budget. You realize that this has immediate consequences on private law. So we are interested in understanding, as you see, looking at the international context and seeing how the international context has effect on the legal system of each of the various countries we have tried to analyze up to now. So just to show that these, as you see, the BIS and the Financial Stability Board have a very, very effective influence on legal relations, both financial relations and debit credit relations in the various countries of which belong to the systems we have analyzed up to now. I would, before moving to the next slides. Any questions on this first part, World Bank, BIS, and Financial Stability Board? No questions?
Professor.
Yes, I just, can you, just trying to see the volume. I'm trying to see, I don't hear you very well. Let's see if I can lift the volume. Well, I've put it to maximum. Who's speaking?
Adimari.
Adimari, you must raise the volume. I can't hear you. I don't know if the rest of the class can hear you.
Okay. I didn't really get how the Financial Stability Board work with the country in crisis.
What happens is the Financial Stability Board, as you see, is G20, so there are 20 countries. And so, and they're variously distributed between, obviously, Europe, North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. The main countries which are, when they see that there's in one region, there's a moment of crisis. Now, this moment of crisis could be due to, well, typically war. Just think of conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries. And so there's, this has immediate effects on economic. Just think of the fact of the oil that no longer can be extracted and brought through the Persian Gulf to other countries, mostly Asian countries. And so this has immediate effects on the economy. So when they realize that there is a moment of economic crisis or financial crisis, the two things are very much tied together. Well, the result is that immediately they say what is the risk? What can happen from a financial point of view? The main concern, obviously, is that there is the default of a country. What is the default of a country? Just let me write this term out so you've met it lots of times, but now you... Default. Default is when someone, I don't repay my debts. I have lots of debts I don't repay, and I do default. And then well, if I'm a businessman, I go bankrupt and I don't repay them because I have nothing left. There's absolutely nothing, and I go into liquidation, but there's no money to repay my creditors. So just think of a country that does not repay a debt. Remember, when we started analyzing the role of public debt, we've seen that since at least since after the First World War, and especially after the Great Depression of 1929, states had started spending much more than what they had. So they made public debt. We've seen that certain countries, Italy is a very good example, or has a very high public debt. Other countries, Switzerland has a very low public debt. But we have been, so when a country makes default, it means that it doesn't repay all those who have lent money to their country. This is what is happening again, second time over 10, 15 years in Argentina. Argentina is in a dramatic financial situation and is not able to repay its debts and is somehow trying to say, well, I won't declare default, but I'm pretty near to that situation. So what does the Financial Stability Board try to do? It senses that there is a very strong a financial risk, and there's a country that is can declare default. Is it a temporary situation? Just think of a country that is struck by an earthquake or a tsunami, and so everything is blocked. But hopefully we'll recover. Well, it takes time, but we think that it can recover. So it is a temporary situation, and so the Financial Stability Board will say these are the immediate measures you must take, and you can obtain. Well, you will obtain money for overnight money, for example, from the BIS, and short-term loans from the IMF. So these various institutions work together. BIS works overnight. I find myself in difficulty, I need money tomorrow morning, and I find myself money, central bank, I find money that I can spend the next morning. So just to point out that this is how the Financial Stability Board works, and it somehow influences decisions that are taken by the states. It is totally informal. The Financial Stability Board is not an international organization, not even an international institution. It is simply a meeting of 20 ministers of finance and governors of central banks who, however, know very well that the problem in this global world, the fact what happens in one country, let's imagine Indonesia, well, is very significant in other countries. It's not something, if Indonesia has a financial crisis, it's not going to remain there. It's going to have contagion in Malaysia, Thailand, and maybe spread to the other region, go to India. So just to point out that we, in a global world, we're very much interconnected. And so Financial Stability Board wants to avoid this domino effect. So one country is in difficulty, and this, if it is not helped, it is not brought to the financial emergency ward. Well, it could have, this contagion could be spread to other countries. So this is how it works. So the Financial Stability Board is there to control and to take immediate effect, and then it says, well, immediate action, and then it says, well, for the money, go to the BIS. They are both based there. Both the Financial Stability Board and the BIS are in Basel, so they work in very strong coordination. And so if there is immediate need of cash overnight, well, BIS can provide it. I hope that clarifies your question. Any more questions? Okay, if there are no more questions, let's go on. Now, we've seen up till now, IMF, World Bank, BIS, Financial Stability Board, looking at financial aspects. Financial aspects is when we are looking mostly at the sort of situation of future credits. We're looking at what monies that are expectations. You're expecting that money will come in the future. You've sold something and you're expecting money will come back. And obviously, this is what banks and financial sector generally does, or even shareholders do. They put money in a company and they are expecting that at the end of the year, they will receive a dividend. So that is financial economy. So that is, now let's look instead at what we call real economy. Relationships that have to do not with future credits, but with the provision of goods and services. Now, what has happened, as I've already mentioned, there's always been international trade. The story of the world has been history of international trade, whatever part of the world. What we are interested in seeing is how in this global world, globalized world, how international trade and rules for international trade have an effect on legal systems. Because again, the whole idea is that you can study a legal system, you can know everything about Germany, about Italy, about the UK, but if you don't place this legal system in a broader context, in a global context, you'll only get to see one small part of the system because you don't understand what are the relations of this country, this legal system with other much more complex systems. It's just like looking at a person and you know everything about this person, but you know nothing of the relations that this person has, whatever kinds of relation, economic, social, emotional, you know nothing about the relations that this person has with other persons. So just to point out that we are interested in seeing how, from when looking at real economy, what are the institutions, the rules that influence the legal systems. Now, what we're going to do now is look at the World Trade Organization, WTO. Now, let's start from the beginning. WTO comes much later. It starts in 1947 in Geneva among sort of the various actions taken by the United Nations for the reconstruction of the world economy. So in 1947 in Geneva, there is this General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, which is some of the many agreements which are taken in the view of reconstructing the world economy that had been destroyed by World War II. Now, what is the objective of the GATT Treaty? General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Trade means obviously trade, where you exchange, and we're talking of trade between countries. Obviously, we're not looking at trade within the same country. We're not interested in that. We're interested in trade between different countries. And tariffs. What are tariffs? Tariffs are taxes that are levied by one country when there are imports in its territory. So you have, let's imagine, obviously before the GATT Treaty, you have French champagne that is imported in Italy, and to enter Italy must pay tariff, and let's imagine that instead there are Italian ham that is exported to France, and when it arrives to the frontier, it must pay a tariff when it is imported in the country. So historically, there's no trade without a tariff. Why? Because states have always felt that this was a very good way of making money, of collecting taxes. This obviously existed 4,000 years ago. It isn't something a recent invention. You were in some Mesopotamian, Babylonian empire, and you had cloths, purple cloths brought by Phoenician traders. Well, these Phoenician traders, when they wanted to sell their cloths, their fabrics in Babylon, well, they had to pay a tariff. They had to pay taxes to enter the Babylonian Empire. So the taxes have always, for imports, have always existed. So General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Trade is international trade, means that there are always tariffs. So what is the objective of the GATT Treaty? I've tried to make a very short summary. Reciprocal and mutually advantageous arrangements directed to the substantial reduction of tariffs and other barriers to trade and to the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. Now, what does this mean? So, if you have very high tariffs, obviously you're protecting your own market. Why do I put a very strong, let's imagine we're 1947. Why do I put a very high tariff on champagne? Well, because I want to have money. That's a good reason. I'm the state, the Italian state wants money, but at the same time, I want to protect my sparkling wine industry, whether it is Spumante, Prosecco, whatever you call it. I'm trying to protect my industry. So it has a dual function. Tariffs have, for imports, have a dual function. Collecting revenue for the state, but protecting domestic industry. So the whole idea is that reducing, if you reduce tariffs, well, you're reducing a barrier to trade. If my champagne pays, let's imagine, 50%, a 50% tariff for each bottle, obviously champagne costs an enormous amount of money, and therefore people go to the wine shop and they see a bottle of champagne. How much does a bottle of champagne cost? It costs 150. How much does a bottle of local sparkling wine cost? Well, it costs 60, 70. Well, listen, I don't have all that money. I don't have so much money to spend. I won't buy champagne. I'll buy local Prosecco or Spumante, and that's it. So it is just to show you that this means that obviously French champagne producers will obviously export much less champagne to Italy because Germany or other countries, because they know that when the consumers compare prices, they will prefer the domestic product that has no tariffs against imported product that has a very high tariff. And you can apply this. I've made an example of champagne, but you could apply it to South Korean automobiles or Indian automobiles, and just think that you put high tariffs to avoid that everybody buys, instead of buying European cars, they buy South Korean or Japanese cars or Indian cars, just to show you how tariffs operate. Second element, elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. Because what happened in the past? You were in good terms with France, but were in bad terms with Germany. So what you said, you told French, okay, there's no problem of you French exporting champagne to Italy, but as we are in bad terms with Germany, well, when German wines, Rhine, Germany is a strong producer of wine, especially in the Rhine region, well, we put a very high tariff there. So we start discriminating between, we're saying, who are our friends? Oh, that country, they are our friends. Okay, then we do a low tariff. That country, are they those? That other country, are they our friends? No, not very much. They're always nasty from a commercial point of view. With us, well, we'll put a high tariff. So just this is the whole aim of GATT, was that of reducing tariffs, increasing international trade, and eliminating discrimination. Now, if we look from a practical point of view, the GATT treaty has been one of the most successful international treaties in the history in these last 70, as you can see, 73 years. In 1947, the average tariff for industrial goods, that means that they're produced in an industrial way. This is very important. We'll see other products and services apart. The average was 40%. So there was an industrial product, whether it was a bottle of champagne, an automobile, a machinery, or clothes. Well, the average was 40%. This means that there were some that were 100% and others that were 20%. So this shows you the sort of how heavy tariffs were. Now, after 70 years, around 3%. very low. I mean, 3%, if you think that there's a product that costs 100, and well, we'll put a tariff of 3, so it costs 103. Does this obviously reduces sort of somehow protectionism for local product. If the local product costs 100 and the imported products cost 103, well, consumers will say, hey, well, it isn't all that different. I'll buy an imported product. So this means that there's quite a lot of competition. Why has this happened? Because if you just think of it, it's a very basic economic knowledge. I mean, obviously, if I have 40%, but I have 40% over one product, that means I bring home 40. Let's imagine the product is €1 and the tariff is 40%. That means the state brings home 40. But if instead of having 1 unit of product which is imported, I have 10 units, well, if I have these 10 units and I apply a 3%, this means in 10 units I already have 30, so which is less than 40, but the state has already brought in 30. So instead of being, if they're not 10, but they're 100, well, I brought in 300, which is much more. So the whole idea is that of increasing international trade, because more units are moved from one country to another, the more you can as revenue, the state can collect as import tariffs. So you see there's a convenience in increasing circulation of goods, because the more goods are important, the more are imported in a country, well, even if the tariff is low, you will get lots of money. So this shows enormous success in international trade. This means, well, we see it in our developed countries, we can buy products from all around the world, and there's not all that difference whether the products come from one country or another. There are some exceptions, and now things are complex, especially because President Trump has a very aggressive international trade attitude. But generally speaking, we've seen that over 70 years, tariffs have gone down, and we can choose, as in developed countries, we can choose between products coming from many parts of the world. What was the problem with GATT? GATT was simply an agreement. It was an international treaty. It had a very small secretariat which somehow didn't work. Couldn't cope very much. But it was, well, obviously at that time, when it was started, when GATT started, it was a very small agreement between, we'll see it in a moment, between a few countries. Now it is a very big, complex institution. So it was simply an agreement, an international agreement, which somehow told, the idea was reducing tariffs, increasing trade, avoid discrimination. But we must go slightly more in this aspect because it is. What are the turning points in GATT? First of all, 1989, I've already mentioned it. Fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, Russia, and all the satellite countries, Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. So this means that all this area opened up to free trade. This means that you could export to these countries and you could import from those countries. So just to point out that this is very important. So that's 1989. Then in 1995, we had the creation of the WTO. Why? Because we've realized that there was, so the world main countries realized that the system, the economic system was opening up. In People's Republic of China, things was already in the 80s, they started moving, 1982, Deng Xiaoping and so on, they started moving, and there was a very substantial economic development of China, and so China became a country where you wanted to export. And so in 1995, we have the creation of the WTO, which is a real international organization. We'll see it in a moment. And in 2001, 6 years later, the accession of the People's Republic of China to the WTO. What does this mean? It means that China has entered in a free trade mechanism. That means that goods can move. Obviously, China is very interested in exporting, but it also, and we are very interested in exporting our products, European, Western products to China. So just to point out that there's mutual, just remember that sort of mutual and mutually satisfactory and advantageous agreements. So the fact that China entered the WTO meant that China, whatever its political sort of regime is and qualifies itself, well, it is committed to very general principles of free trade. So this gives an enormous boost to international trade. So we see that in 1947, the GATT treaty was 23 countries, very small, because the world was small. It wasn't decolonization. It was small world from an economic point of view, and the world was still recovering from the destruction of the World War. Now 164 states. So you see, well, obviously the states have increased. There are many more states than they were in 1947, but, well, 100 is a very big organization, a very strong organization. I won't enter into the detail because we're not, this is not a class on international trade law, but just to point out, this shows how international trade has been developing over these last 70 years. Now, where are we interested? We are interested in three fundamental legal principles that are at the basis of the GATT agreement and the WTO system. WTO is the organization that somehow organizes all the principles of the GATT agreement. The GATT agreement was an international agreement, and so, but as this agreement became very complex to manage, well, we created in 1995 the WTO, which uses the principles established in the GATT treaty, plus a whole lot of other principles, but is a real international organization which somehow falls under the system of the United Nations. It is somehow related to the international, to the United Nations. Now, what are why are we interested in this? Because we could say, well, this is international trade. No, international trade is part of a legal system because, as I've mentioned, a country does not exist by itself. Even if you're North Korea, well, you need to have relations with, at least with China. At least you have relations with one country, maybe not with the rest of the world, but at least with China you have a relation. So normally other countries have relations with the rest of the world. I mean, you can start saying, no, I won't have relations with this country or another country. But generally speaking, in the global world, all countries are somehow tied one to another in what happens, and you are forced to take into account what happens in another country. So, international trade. What are the three fundamental principles that are set out by the GATT agreement and are put into place by WTO? First principle, most favored nation. Now, this is a very important principle that we find in international law, in international treaties. It's always been there, but we apply this to international trade. What does it mean? If two countries, just think that Canada and Brazil find an agreement on the tariff for the import or export of a certain product, and so there's an agreement simply between Canada and Brazil. The two ministers of trade, Canadian Minister of Trade, Brazilian Minister of Trade, they find an agreement for, well, just think of sort of shipping of, well, certain products which come from Canada to Brazil or vice versa. And they establish a tariff. Let's imagine they establish a low tariff for the importation of products from Brazil to Canada or vice versa, from Canada to Brazil. That tariff, they have agreed on, let's say low tariff, 5%, must be applied to the same product coming from a third country. So let's imagine that Canada has found an agreement with Brazil on the basis of which flour, wheat, that comes from Canada, Canada is a great producer of wheat, when it enters, Brazil pays, let's say, a 5% tariff. If there's another country, let's say Argentina, which is another very big producer of wheat, that same tariff must be applied to Argentina, even if, let's imagine that Argentina and Brazil are on very bad terms, and therefore Brazil says, oh, but we want to punish economically Argentinian producers of wheat, and so we're going to put a high tariff, 20%. Well, you can't, on the basis of the WTO agreement, on the basis of the most favored nation principle, means that if there's wheat that is coming from any other part of the world, if Canada has found an agreement at 5%, all the other countries that want to export wheat to Brazil will pay 5%. So just to show you this is, and you could apply this to if the European Union finds an agreement with South Korea establishing that automobiles, Hyundai's, Kias, and SsangYong pay, let's say, a 15% tariff for the import of automobiles produced in South Korea to the European Union. Well, if there is an Indian producer, or let's say Tata or Mahindra, that wants to export its automobiles to European Union, it's 15%, because same product, same tariff, wherever it comes from. Even if you haven't negotiated, you can't say, oh, but I've negotiated this agreement only with South Korea. Sorry very much. On the basis of the most favored nation, it applies to all countries. So this is the first principle. Fundamental, as you see, it's a legal principle. It's not something that is sort of, yes, obviously has economic consequences, but it is a legally binding principle for all members of the WTO. Second principle, national treatment principle. Once product has paid custom duties, so let's imagine a product has arrived, the Hyundais have arrived in a port, whether it is Hamburg, Rotterdam, or Joyatown, or whatever, or Leghorn, they have arrived there, and they're being paid their duty. Let's imagine it's 15% customs duty on Hyundais that are produced in South Korea, and they arrive in a European port. Once they've entered the country and they've paid their duty, they cannot be discriminated. You can't say, oh, but I'm going to put a value-added tax on domestic products. It's, let's say, a 20% value-added tax. If it's instead, if it's a foreign product, I'm going to apply a 30% value-added tax. No, no discrimination. So the principle of non-discrimination of imported products, once these imported products have paid their custom duties. So you can't start saying, oh, but yes, you pay custom duties, but now I'm going to make you pay extra taxes for being, or I'm going to say, oh, they can't be distributed here or there. So just to show you, once they enter the country, their national treatment, they will receive the same treatment, they must receive the same treatment as any domestically produced product. So again, this is legally binding. And then finally, third fundamental legal principle of the GATT system, and obviously then of the WTO system, is that there's prohibition of quantitative limitations. So you can't say, oh, but I'm going to import only 1,000 cars from South Korea. No, you can't impose that unless you have, we're going to analyze that. But in general, you cannot do restrictions to importation. Say, oh, I'm going to protect myself from these South Korean producers that produce enormous amount of Japanese producers that produce so many cars. Well, I'm going to put a quantitative restriction. So not more than 1,000, 100,000 cars from this part of the world. And that is a way of protecting one's market. No, they cannot be quotas to import. I'll put aside quotas to export. It's But the whole idea is that of free trade. Free trade means free trade. That if there's a request for that product, I have produced good cars, Toyota produces good cars, and people want to buy Toyotas instead of buying Volkswagen, Fiats, Renaults, well, let them buy Toyotas, because obviously they find that these cars are better than domestically produced cars. So just to point out that this is the, these are the main legal principles of, at the basis, many more legal principles at the basis of the WTO, GATT and WTO system, and why it is so important for our legal systems when we look at how we organize from a legal point of view trade, and also our fiscal, our taxation system. Just to point out, well, this was the bright side of the WTO, GATT and WTO. Then there's a sort of much less bright side, the fact that there's very modest results when it comes to trade in agriculture, agricultural goods, and in products and in services. So here we see that the system hasn't worked very well. Especially we Europeans are very, very protective. We love free trade when it comes to export. When it comes to importing agricultural products from countries which have only agricultural, mostly agricultural products, well, we are not so free trade. This happens in Europe, it happens also in the US. There's quite a lot of hypocrisy behind the sort of free trade rhetoric, because obviously everybody is very willing to do free trade when you have to export. And everybody, US and Europe, are very sort of less favorable to free trade when it comes to import. And to protect our farmers, and there are very good reasons to protect European farmers, well, we don't think that we should give free trade to agricultural products coming from other parts of the world. Just to point out, so this shows that hasn't worked very well either in services. And as a matter of fact, there is this very strong conflict between developed countries and developing countries. And as the GATT treaties have been renewed over the years in rounds, there's been since 2001, there's been this Doha round in Qatar, and in 20 years, nothing really has come out. So just to show you that the WTO system is somehow has very positive aspects, but also some dark sides that have not brought to much results, typically for agricultural products and services. Just to point out that this system. So I will stop here for this part of the module and just ask if there are any questions on the WTO, if it's sufficiently clear what I've presented to you. Questions? No. Well, okay. Just to, as I've mentioned in that message I sent to everybody at the beginning of the lesson, who is at the head of WTO? Presently it is, I think he's Latin American. Sorry, you're just you put me a good question. You'll have to go. I'm trying to think. It is Herrera. No, Gutierrez is the Secretary General of the UN. But it's I'm trying to remember in this precise moment. I'm always on WTO website.
Is Roberto Azevedo.
Azevedo, well, Azevedo, yes, sorry, Brazilian. I would expect all Portuguese. Azevedo is a typical Portuguese or Brazilian name. It is, the WTO is a very complex. What it does, I mean, I've presented in a very, very summary way, but it has a whole lot. For example, now in this pandemic, there's been a whole lot of restrictions in the export of medical equipment. So all countries said, hey, first we must look after the health of our citizens, and so they put restrictive quotas at that for export, not for imports. They said, hey, first thing, machinery, masks, garments for doctors and paramedics. Well, first of all, for our National Health Service. So just to point out that there's, and all countries around the world have put limitations to export. They said, no, first of all, we must provide these essential items to our National Health Service, and then maybe we can help other countries. So just to point out that it is in these times, troubled times, well, we find, just I showed you an example of limitations to exports. You protect why you don't want to export, because you have a national health issue and you don't want to export your products. So this is just to show you how much the WTO is very much involved in regulating the situation of trade in these complex times. Now, as I've mentioned in the message I sent to you at the beginning of the lesson, I'm slowly sort of trying to organize the exams, and I hope in this week to be sending you, I'm talking of the Italian students of the GLS program. For the Erasmus students, that would be something different, similar, very similar, but the kind of exam would be slightly different from the two groups. For what concerns the Global Legal Studies program students, I just wanted to tell you that it will be a so-called open books exam. It will be a written exam. It will be open books in the sense that you will have access to internet resources, just as you had access when we did that mock test on the pandemic. So this is the first point I wanted to make to you. So it will be open. My interest is, as I've already mentioned, it's not that of knowing how much you've got notions. I hope you have received enough notions in the class, but how you're able to reason, how you use your brain, what is between your left ear and your right ear. So how you use your brain, how you reason, and obviously what your writing skills are. This is something that will improve. This is not a sort of a literature class, and so I will obviously not, but you must start acquiring good skills in writing. I mean, this is one of the purposes of the Global Legal Studies program. So just to give you this first indication, it will be a written exam, an open books exam, and that the dates of the exams are those that were already fixed. They were fixed way before we had the close down, the lockdown. So the dates have not changed, and so that will. I will. There are a few technical issues that I'm slowly solving, and we sort of find an appropriate way. In fact, that everybody can, when the exam comes, can take part in the exam. There's no problem in taking part, and I know who's taking the exam. This is an obvious issue. I mean, it is true that when they say on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, but I would like, although I do like dogs, but I don't think it would be appropriate if a dog took the exam. So I want to know who's taking the exam. I want to identify who's taking the exam. So just to point out, these are the basic information. Then I elaborate and I'll send something written, but just to sort of as I know this is one of your concerns, and today is the 11th of May, and the first exam session is on the 3rd of June, so it isn't so far away. So I'm just telling you, I want you to give you you're more confident and you know what's expecting you. So this is the first information I'm going to provide, and then I will provide, obviously, everything will be in writing, and because obviously this is an administrative procedure, so it will be, I will send a message to everybody explaining how it works, how things work. Any questions on this issue? Or?
Yes, sir. Chloe Anzalone speaking.
Sorry, can you?
Yes, do you hear me?
Can you lift the volume? I can't hear you very well. I don't know why, but today the volume is very low. I don't know. I'm trying to understand if it's my computer or.
I don't know how to.
Well, you should have the general speaker on the right hand. I don't know if you have a PC. It's on the and you have Windows. Well, on the right you have. You should have the microphone, and you lift the volume there.
Yeah, the volume is at the maximum right now.
Okay, so let's see who is speaking.
Chloe Anzalone.
Yes.
Can you tell me? Can you confirm that we can take the exam on the 22nd of June? Because I saw some dates, but we are really not used to.
The dates are confirmed. The dates that I set, and I set them last year in autumn, so rather at the end of the first semester. So those dates are fixed, and those are the dates, and those are also the hour in which you will be taking the exam. So the dates and the hour, it will be there morning, in this precise moment.
Yes, but actually I'm asking the question because we are not used to the.
Yes, it's 22nd. Yes, 22nd, Monday the 22nd, from 8:30 to 10:30. Confirmation is confirmed. It is those dates. The 11th of June, 3rd of June. Sorry, Wednesday, 3rd of June. Monday the 22nd, and then I put one really at the end of July, on the 20th of July. And so those are 3 dates. Those dates remain, and the exam it is a written exam. It is from 8:30 to 10:30. Obviously, you will be at distance, and so you will be doing it. But Erasmus students, such as yourself, I will send you instructions. The exam for you, Erasmus students, will be more or less like the exam of the previous years, because there's no reason to make a difference of the kind of exam that was given to students of last year, while our global legal systems, global legal studies students, for our first year students, obviously I will have to organize an exam which is more appropriate for them, because they're on their first year, second semester, their first year. And so obviously they are not supposed to know the same amount as you are. You're not first year students. So, I mean, this is why it will be tailored on their knowledge, level of knowledge.
Okay, thank you. So, sorry for asking again the question. It's just because we are not used to use.
No. I mean, I'm here for this. I mean, no problem. But I'll be writing, as I've said in this short message. I said I will be sending specific instructions, both for the GLS students and for the Erasmus students. But the content, the way the exam is dealt with, will be exactly the same. The content of the exam will be slightly different, because you Erasmus students, I suppose, you know much more than your Italian colleagues, because you are not first year students. So obviously I cannot expect from them the same things I think I can expect from you.
Okay, it's clear. Thank you very much, Professor.
Any more questions from the class?
Yes, Professor, I have a question. Or better, I have two.
Who's speaking?
Di Domenico Antonio.
Okay, yes.
The first is quite quick. If you can send us the slides of the previous week's lesson and also...
I'll send them. Sorry, I wanted to finish the module. I haven't sent them to you because today we finished the module, and so I'll be sending them to you.
Okay.
It's only for this reason, because I prefer to send you the whole block. I mean,
yes, right.
If you've noticed, I've tried to send you the whole block of the during the week. If we find the module now, we're practically finished, because from tomorrow we'll start looking at sort of wrapping up, as the Americans say, wrapping up the class and sort of putting everything together. I will. I'll be sending them to you. Well, if it isn't this evening, it's tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, do you already know if we will use the same kind of methods the university already has?
Same kind of?
Methods, the same methods the university has said to us, the same ways we will do the written exam, because you say that it's an open book exam, but at the same time, university has said that for the written proofs, we should use it's like a program which blocks us. If
no, this is obviously, if it is, sorry very much, if it is a certain kind of exam, obviously, if it is an oral exam, obviously, if you have all the answers on your monitor, well, that's easy. But yeah, in this case, it is an open books, and it is perfectly legitimate to do an open books exam. I mean, nobody's forced to do it. I mean, others, for example, Professor Resta, who teaches Sistemi Giuridici Comparati, the Italian comparative legal systems, in the first year, so your colleagues who did not choose GLS, and teaches at the same time new technologies law, and so has two different classes. So for the Italian students who are doing the Italian comparative legal systems, Sistemi Giuridici Comparati, it will be one kind of exam. It will be a closed book exam for them, while for this other class, which is an advanced class in high-tech digital technology law, well, it will be an open books exam. So, I mean, it depends on, some professors will do an oral exam, some will do a test, test, simply a test with yes, no answers 1, 2, 3, and others will do other kinds of exams. The important thing is that each professor, in accordance to what the object of the class is, depends very much on the class, what is the level of the students, the amount of the students, because if you have 300 students, it's much more complex. Here we have a reasonably limited class. I mean, you're 60, more or less 60 students. I trust you will not all do it on the 3rd of June, or you will not all do it on the 22nd of June, but you will distribute yourself among the 3 sessions of between June and July. Maybe someone will take the exam in September. So, I mean, there will be a limited amount, and that this will allow me to control the classroom while you're doing exams. Obviously, if there were 300 students, well, this would be something different. I would have to invent a different have a different system of exam. But your browser will not be blocked. I will not apply Respondus, because obviously you cannot do an open books exam if you don't have access to the internet.
Okay, thank you. My question was probably about more or less a curiosity, not probably as...
No, don't, it's not, I mean, it's essential. I mean, obviously, because then I would like to remind you that exams are the administrative procedure, and therefore it must follow certain rules. I mean, otherwise, if it doesn't follow, the exam doesn't follow these procedures, obviously it would not be valid. So, I mean, they have to be, I will write down a memo. I will first verify that this memo is okay with the department, with the director of the department. And so just to point out that, I mean, it has to be, I mean, this is a law school, and so rules are important. Also in these apparently small aspects, we've tried to sort of follow certain rules, flexible rules, but we've tried to follow certain rules to ensure that everything works out properly.
Thank you.
More other questions?
I have a question.
Who is speaking?
Lorenzo Giovanniello.
Giovanniello. Yes.
Yes, I saw that we have our first date, I think, in... sorry, I have my...
The 3rd of June, 22nd of June, 20th of July.
Okay. But for us that are going, for me and my colleague that are going to do the first exam for the certification, we can have make the exam in June even without the certification, thinking about that we are going to get it in June, or
yes, sorry, yeah, sorry, I've understood this. You are asking me a question which is somehow beyond my control. I'm not able to somehow control language certifications. This issue, I think someone made these, had this issue. I think it was Adinolfi, but I'm not sure. Some other student. And I refer, please write to Mr. Netri, Ferruccio Netri, and that I think I sent you all the instructions of the Centro Linguistico di Ateneo on language certifications. So I don't know, I mean, clearly, if there's going to be some kind of, some possibility to sort of, you take the exam and then provide the certification afterwards. So I will suspend the evaluation of the exam, waiting for the certification. I will try. Obviously, I'm very flexible, and I look at the substance, but it doesn't depend only on me because I don't control the computer system on whether you can register or will not be able to register for the exam, because obviously only students who have registered for the exam can take the exam. So please, if you have these specific doubts, especially on the fact that sort of whether on the 3rd of June, because you will have to register within a certain amount of days before the exam, just verify these yourselves, as is a very good Latin expression, which I ask you to remember, and remember for all your life as young lawyers and adult lawyers. Vigilantibus iura succurrunt. That is that the laws aid those who are vigilant, those who are awake, not those who are somehow passive and just let things go. So please, just if you have these concerns, please write to Mr. Netri, write and insist on having an answer. And if you don't receive any answer, then you could write to me and I will pressure the administration to give you the appropriate answer. For the moment, I'm unable because I don't control the whole machinery, the administrative procedure on registration for reservation of the exams and registration of the exams once you've taken.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? If there are no more questions, then we can close the lesson here, and we meet tomorrow. We reconvene tomorrow for tomorrow's lesson, and I'll try between sort of tomorrow, Wednesday, and the next week. I'll try to wrap up, as they say in America, the whole class and put all the things. Try to make sense to what the various aspects you've seen in these 8 modules, and try to put them together and give them sort of the idea that not 8 sort of pieces of different courses all distributed around, disorderly distributed, but put them in some kind of order. But we'll discuss this tomorrow and next lessons. Good afternoon to everybody, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye.